Buenos dias. I understand that you have a difficult job, listening to me speaking in English and wishing we were drinking coffee. So I'll be as quick as I can and as pain-free as I can. Firstly, thank you for a wonderful introduction and congratulations on your first Chilean conference on Antarctic law. When I mentioned in my university that I was coming here for the first Chilean conference, people said the first one, but the Antarctic Treaty is 60 years old. So that is my question to you. What has taken you so long? I'm doing some work on how good the Antarctic Treaty is with Professor Shibata and Luis Ferrara. And this is the presentation that I'm going to give you is part of the project that we're looking at, the resilience of the Antarctic Treaty. I should mention that my Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies is located in Hobart, in Tasmania, a very beautiful city which is home to, yes, people have been there, yeah, the Australian Antarctic Program. It's the Secretariat for the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, so CAMLR is located there, and also the Secretariat for the Agreement on the Conservation of Albatrosses and Petrels. So we are surrounded by experts in Hobart and very fortunate to have so many good people around us. And my institute is also multidisciplinary, so science, all kinds of sciences, law, policy, social sciences, history, all of those different disciplines, we all work together. So I can tell you about the biology of krill, if you'd rather. No? Okay. So, yes, that's yours. So what is customary international law? First of all, it is a contentious, ambiguous, fluid, problematic concept. So maybe I should stop now. The Statute of the International Court of Justice gives us some ideas about how to look at customary international law. And Article 38.1b says evidence of a general practice accepted as law. So there are two components: state practice, which is general and consistent, and a belief by the state that they have a legal obligation. Some academic research doesn't help because it puts more emphasis on the first component, and they call that traditional, customary international law, more so than the second, which is often called modern customary international law. But I have deferred to the International Law Commission because they probably know best about these things. So they have a document called the Identification of Customary International Law, which is a very useful document. The scope of that is the way in which the existence and content of rules of customary international law are to be determined. So if we want to know whether the Antarctic Treaty, over its 60-year life, has become custom in international law that applies to everybody, this is the kind of document that will be helpful to us. The International Law Commission says there are two basic approaches, two constituent elements general practice that's accepted as law. So just like in the International Court of Justice statute, which is quite old, this 2018 document confirms. It doesn't deal with the burden of proof, and that is a whole different story here. But what it does say is that assessment, regard must be had to the context, the overall context when we're looking at state practice, the nature of the rule, and the particular circumstances in which the evidence in question is to be found. So when you're assessing whether the way states behave could create a legal obligation on them, the assessment of any and all available evidence must be very careful and very contextual. And each of those two constituent elements, so state practice and obligation, are to be assessed separately, and this requires an assessment of evidence for each element, which is important, I think. So if we look at what we are expecting from those perhaps 150 countries that are not parties to the Antarctic Treaty, the rules in this 2018 International Law Commission document suggest that the general practice relates to both states and sometimes international organisations as well. State practice that contributes to the formation or expressions of rules for customary international law, but also the practice of international organisations in some cases, and other actors may also be relevant at certain times. So it starts to be not just states who are important in this story, but international organisations, and I'll talk more about those in just a moment. State practice, there are some things that states such as Chile or Australia, Japan should be doing, and if it was customary law, other states would be doing things such as making diplomatic acts and correspondence, conduct in connection with resolutions from international organisations can be evidence of state practice, or conduct that results from intergovernmental conferences, conduct in connection with treaties, and executive conduct, legislative and administrative acts, and we just heard all about the kinds of legislative procedures that occur in Chile, and decisions sometimes from national courts as well. Now, these are not hierarchical. There's not one that's more important than the others, so they all can provide some evidence, and they'd all be assessed as a whole. What we're trying to do here is to try to understand how the Antarctic Treaty might apply to countries that are not parties to the treaty, because this is outside the rules of international law generally. The practice of states must be sufficiently widespread, representative and consistent, but there's no specific time frame involved. The Antarctic Treaty is 60 years old. Do we have to, has custom already developed, or do we have to wait another year or 5 or 10? We don't know, so that's unhelpful. In terms of feeling a legal obligation, the practice of states must be undertaken with a sense of legal right or obligation, and not just a habit or a choice, but something that you feel you must be doing. And evidence for opinio juris can include public statements made on behalf of states, saying they feel this obligation, official publications, government legal opinions, diplomatic correspondence, decisions of national courts, treaty provisions, and conduct resulting from international and intergovernmental conferences and so on. The subsidiary means of looking for evidence of customary practice include treaties, international court decisions, resolutions. They can't create rules by themselves because generally they're not binding, but they may contribute to a portfolio of evidence. And of course the teachings of highly qualified publicists and jurists. Interestingly, in Antarctica we have historically two persistent objectors, the United States and the former Soviet Union, now Russia, and they consistently object to the claims of any country, so Chilean claim, Australian claim, all the claims. They do not recognise any claims and have reserved the right to claim any or all of Antarctica for themselves at some point in the future. That's how we generally interpret their behaviour. So where a state has objected to a rule of customary international law, while that rule was in the process of formation, the rule is not opposable to the state concerned for so long as it maintains its objection. That objection must be clearly expressed, made known to other states, and maintained persistently. We don't have any persistent objectors outside the Antarctic Treaty, as far as I know, and I'd be happy to hear of some if you know of any. We did have countries that were objectors for some time, including Malaysia, but Malaysia is now a party to the Antarctic Treaty, so they don't fit here. But it would be interesting to see if there are others that this might apply to. So what's so special about the Antarctic Treaty? Well, I'm one of the treaty's biggest fans, and I hope that nothing bad happens during my lifetime. We're going well so far. I'm older than the treaty, by the way. The object and purpose, and we've heard this from people this morning, is the peaceful use of Antarctica. And freedom of scientific investigation. All those lines on the map that represent claimed area are irrelevant if you do science in Antarctica. You can do science anywhere, and that is your right under the Antarctic Treaty. We have 53 countries that are contracting parties, and of those, 29, including the original signatories, such as us, are the ones who are making decisions by consensus, which I think is really important value to maintain in the Antarctic Treaty, because consensus doesn't disenfranchise any one of those decision makers. Makes for slow lawmaking sometimes, but better. And this is my personal opinion. It has got nothing to do with the Australian government. I probably should have said that at the beginning. Any country can become an Antarctic Treaty contracting party, either as a UN member state or, if not a UN member state, at the invitation of those consultative parties. And the fundamental rules that the treaty parties use to achieve the object and purpose of peace and freedom of science include consensus, as I said, those annual meetings, which a number of us have attended, which are very boring unless you're listening in French sometimes. Recommendations are made at those meetings by consensus, and they're taken home to the governments to bring into force, which is a really important way of making Antarctic law. The banning of military activity other than support for science is a fundamental part of the Antarctic Treaty, and also the banning of nuclear activity, the testing of weapons and the dumping of waste. This acknowledgement about the sovereign claims is a really important thing. Article 4 is the fundamental, the core of the Antarctic Treaty, I think. But that provides the claimants with not full sovereignty, an inability to exert full sovereign rights over others, to the exclusion of others. We can have sovereignty over our own nationals, but not exert that sovereignty over others, and that's a difficult position. And Article 10 with regard to third parties, which I'll come to in a moment. I'm trying to be quick here. I hope I'm not speaking too quickly for you. So we have this wonderful 60-year-old, almost 60-year-old treaty. What should become customary international law? What's in that treaty that is worth putting on the rest of the world? Peace, obviously, this is what we all want. And no military activity or no testing of nuclear weapons or use of nuclear weapons would be even worse. Sharing and making freely available the scientific research from Antarctica. That has always been used to support sovereignty, but in recent decade or more, the actual scientific information that's coming from Antarctica has extreme value because of the way the climate is changing and the fact that the world's climate is driven from the polar regions, but particularly Antarctica. So where that science was once an excuse and the entree to become a decision maker, the science itself is actually becoming much more important. No new claims to territory. Those of us who are claimants are very protective of our claim, and of course that's our chief government policy, is to maintain those claims. So no new claims or extension of existing claims. But a very important right exists in that article, and that is that you don't have to accept the claims of other countries. We talked about nuclear weapons, the obligation to allow parties to inspect your facilities, and the right for you to inspect is also a really important obligation. Consensus I've mentioned, and also we're wondering whether if we accepted the Antarctic Treaty in its entirety as customary law, do we then accept the Madrid Protocol and the ban on mining and environmental evaluation? Because a key part of our government policies these days is protection of the environment as well. Not articulated in the Antarctic Treaty, but articulated through the protocol to the treaty. What rights does the Antarctic Treaty protect? Freedom to work in a peaceful environment, freedom of scientific research, freedom to accede to the Antarctic Treaty if you're a UN member. So no state is not allowed to be part of that. Maintenance of the claims, status quo ante. So 1959, all those lines on the map exist today just as they were then. Freedom to not acknowledge existing claims and or to be a persistent objector. We talked about that. And right to decision making if scientific interest, which resulting now in high quality research, can be demonstrated. The rules for becoming a consultative party are now putting quality on scientific research, not just doing science, but doing good science, which I think is really important. I don't think we'll go through that, except that Article 10 does mention exerting appropriate efforts, not with guns and so on, but other peaceful means, to ensure that other countries abide by the treaty. So maybe there's some intent in that article. Which countries would want the Antarctic Treaty to be customary international law? Well, the claimants might want this, and I haven't thought through this particularly well. If you've got any ideas, coffee's a good time to talk about them. The claimants might want the treaty in part or in whole to be customary because that protects their claims. And Article 4 would bind everybody while the treaty was in force. Continent would remain peaceful, would be used for scientific research, be free from the threat of military activity. But the treaty and the measures in force under the protocol as customary international law would limit what third states could do. So that 150 odd countries outside the treaty system now, they couldn't make claims to Antarctic territory because custom would prevent that. They couldn't conduct military activity there. They couldn't test nuclear weapons. And of course, some of you may be aware of Iran's interest in becoming an Antarctic treaty country, and I've been very fortunate to spend some time working in Iran, and there's interesting, people are drawing parallels between what that country does at home and what potentially they might be thinking about in Antarctica. It would prevent mining if we accepted that the protocol on the environment would also apply. Prevent any activities without the prior environmental approval. Because as non-parties, all of those countries, the 150 outside the treaty system, are not bound by any of these provisions now. This is the slide you wanted to see. Conclusion. There is, unfortunately for an academic, we shouldn't admit to this, but there is no clear guide to the amount, the duration, the frequency, and continuity of state practice required to form traditional custom, which is really unhelpful. How many states need to exhibit this? How long? The International Law Association is silent on these issues. Modern custom might invoke moral issues. So there's a moral question here, which is really complicated. Some groups, particularly political philosophers, consider Antarctica to be common heritage of mankind, and they want the states that are claimants to give back to the world their claimed territory. So there's questions here about whether those Antarctic treaty countries, and particularly the claimants, owe the rest of the world by giving back their Antarctic claims. And are we talking about the Antarctic Treaty as customary law, or the whole system, or the treaty and the protocol, and so on? And I'll leave it there, and would welcome questions and comments and disagreement and discussion over coffee.